It was a warm evening in the heart of downtown Arlington, where the streets buzzed with energy. The rhythmic hum of conversations filled the air as people moved in and out of lively cafes and charming little shops. The neon glow from store signs flickered against the pavement, casting long shadows as the city pulsed with life. Among the crowd, Elijah Grant, a highly decorated Navy SEAL enjoying some well-earned leave, walked with an easy, unhurried stride. He was dressed simply, a snug gray t-shirt that outlined his athletic build, a pair of well-fitted jeans, and a pair of sneakers that had clearly seen a few miles. Draped over his shoulder was a well-worn leather messenger bag, its weight familiar against his side. For the first time in months, Elijah felt a rare sense of peace. No orders, no drills, no missions, just an evening to himself. His destination? A small independent bookstore just a few blocks away. A novel had been on his reading list for far too long, and tonight, he finally had the time to pick it up. Just as he stepped onto the crosswalk, that fleeting moment of tranquility was shattered. The sharp, unmistakable screech of tires cut through the air, yanking Elijah out of his thoughts. A police car rolled up to the curb, the vehicle's presence demanding attention even before it fully stopped. The driver's side door opened with a deliberate slowness, and from it emerged a white police officer, his demeanor exuding quiet authority laced with something colder, something calculating. Officer Carden. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Elijah, scanning him with a gaze that felt less like an assessment and more like a predator, sizing up its next move. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken tension. "Hey, you!" Carden's voice rang out, sharp and forceful, slicing through the background noise like a blade. Elijah instinctively paused mid-step, his head turning just enough to meet the officer's stare. His expression remained neutral, unreadable. "In a bit of a hurry, aren't you?" Carden continued, his tone laced with something that wasn't quite curiosity, more like suspicion, unearned and heavy. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question hung in the air, weighted and deliberate. A few pedestrians slowed down, their footsteps faltering as they sensed the shift in atmosphere. Some cast glances over their shoulders, wary but unwilling to get involved. Others? They barely looked twice because moments like this were far too common. Elijah, however, didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, his voice measured when he finally responded. "Just heading to the bookstore," he said evenly, his tone betraying nothing. Carden folded his arms, a slow smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "Bookstore, huh?" His eyes flicked to the bag, slung over Elijah's shoulder. "That bag of yours? What's in it? Anything I should know about?" There it was. The weight of the officer's gaze pressed down on him, heavy with implication. Elijah could feel it, the silent accusations, the assumption, the unspoken but deafening prejudice. And yet, instead of irritation or anger, something else flickered in his eyes. A quiet, unwavering confidence. "You want to check?" Elijah's voice was steady, carrying an almost imperceptible edge, like a challenge wrapped in casual indifference. Carden's posture stiffened slightly, clearly not expecting that response. His fingers twitched near his belt, the tension between them growing thicker by the second. "I'll be the one asking questions," he snapped, his voice rising just enough to remind everyone who held the badge. A beat of silence passed. The crowd around them grew subtly larger, a few bystanders inching closer, their curiosity piqued. Some pulled out their phones, screens glowing as they began recording, discreetly at first, but not for long. Elijah shifted his weight slightly, his stance still relaxed but holding an undeniable presence. Something about his composure made Carden hesitate. "All right, officer." Elijah finally spoke again, his voice as calm as before. "Let's do this the right way." The murmur of the crowd grew louder. The tension in the air crackled like static, hanging thick between them. And something about Elijah's unwavering poise, his refusal to shrink under scrutiny, seemed to unsettle Carden. The officer squared his shoulders, his stance hardening. He took a step closer, boots clicking sharply against the pavement. "Drop the bag," he ordered, his tone harsher now, as if raising his voice could mask the uncertainty creeping in. Elijah remained still for a moment, studying the officer's face. Then, with precise and deliberate movement, he unhooked the strap from his shoulder, lowering the bag. But there was no submission in the action, only strategy. Carden snatched it up, his grip tightening around the leather handle. His eyes flicked back to Elijah's face, but found no trace of fear. "Hands behind your back." The command came sharp and forceful. The officer's fingers hovered near the cuffs on his belt, ready to escalate. Elijah's brow lifted, a hint of something amusement playing at the corner of his lips. "Am I under arrest?" His voice remained even, unshaken. "You're being detained," Carden shot back, the words rolling off his tongue like a script rehearsed too many times. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." The absurdity of the claim sat in the air like a bad joke. A few people in the crowd exchanged knowing glances, and one woman holding up her phone muttered under her breath, "Here we go again." Elijah exhaled, slow and measured. Then, with a small nod, he stepped forward just slightly. His movements were deliberate, controlled. "All right, Officer Carden," he said, his voice smooth. "Let me help you out." Carden tensed, his grip shifting. His hand hovered just a little closer to his weapon. "Stay right there," he warned. Elijah lifted his hands slightly, non-threatening. "Relax. Just grabbing my ID." His fingers moved with careful precision, reaching into his back pocket. From it, he pulled a sleek black card holder. He flipped it open and extracted a single card. "Military issue." He extended it toward the officer. Carden hesitated. His eyes flickered down, scanning the card. The name, the rank, and then United States Navy SEAL. For the briefest second, his smirk faltered. "You still think I fit the description?" Elijah asked, his voice just as calm, but now carrying an undeniable undertone of amusement. The crowd sensed the shift. The energy around them changed. More phones lifted, openly recording now. The anticipation was thick, electric. Carden clenched his jaw. The muscles in his face twitched, frustration creeping in. He tossed the ID back. "This doesn't mean you're above suspicion," he muttered. "Stay put while I check your bag." Elijah crossed his arms, a slow smirk playing at his lips. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. "Go ahead. Dig yourself deeper." As Carden unzipped the bag and rummaged through its contents, Elijah took a small step back. His stance was relaxed, but the confidence he carried was unmistakable, almost theatrical. "Make sure everyone gets a good look," he said, nodding toward the watching crowd. The air was thick with tension, a powder keg waiting for the next spark. And as Carden crouched slightly, peeling open the zipper, the onlookers leaned in. Phones held steady, cameras rolling, and whatever happened next, the whole world was about to see it. Inside Elijah's leather messenger bag, the contents were meticulously arranged, almost with military precision. A neatly folded book, a sleek black laptop, and a stainless steel water bottle sat side by side, each item placed with purpose. It was the kind of organization that came second nature to someone trained for high-pressure situations. Carden hesitated for just a moment, his fingers grazing the book's spine before pulling it out. He held it up like it was something illicit, his brow furrowed as he read the title aloud. "Leadership Under Pressure: A SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence." The irony of the moment was thick enough for the murmuring crowd to pick up on it instantly. But Carden? He didn't seem to register it at all. His eyes flicked back to Elijah. "What's this?" he demanded, holding the book as if expecting it to reveal some hidden secret. Elijah didn't flinch. His calm, unbothered expression remained intact, though there was now a subtle glint of amusement in his eyes. "That," he said evenly, his voice smooth and measured, "is a book I wrote." Carden blinked. For the first time since this whole encounter began, he looked momentarily thrown. "You wrote this," he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief, as if the very idea were impossible. Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether the officer was serious. "That's what I said," he replied, his voice carrying the faintest trace of amusement. "You want me to sign it for you? Or are you just planning to keep rummaging through my stuff?" A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, the sound sharp and knowing. Someone in the back muttered, "Oh, he got him." Carden's face darkened, his jaw tightening as his grip on the book stiffened. Flustered, he shoved it back into the bag with more force than necessary, as if he could erase his own embarrassment with aggression. His attempt to reassert control was almost comical. "Cut the attitude," he snapped, his voice sharper now, more defensive. "This isn't over." Elijah raised his hands slightly in mock surrender, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smirk, but wasn't far from it either. "Hey, you're the one making a scene," he pointed out, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge, one that made it clear he wasn't intimidated. "I'm just trying to go about my day." Carden ignored the remark, turning his attention back to the bag. He rifled through it with renewed determination, as if sheer persistence would justify his actions. His hands closed around the laptop next. He inspected it closely, turning it over, checking for what exactly? A secret compartment? Contraband? Classified intelligence? Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. With an irritated huff, he set the device aside and reached for the final item, a small, leather-bound journal. As he flipped it open, his eyes narrowed, scanning the crisp, precise handwriting that filled the pages. Unlike the book, this was personal. Detailed entries from Elijah's deployments overseas, reflections on leadership, resilience, sacrifice. And then, Carden's eyes landed on a particular passage. "You don't fight for recognition. You fight because it's the right thing to do. Leadership isn't about power. It's about service." For a split second, Carden froze. His expression barely shifted, but something in his stance wavered. He read the words again, his fingers hesitating on the page. Whatever flickered across his face, he buried it quickly. The crowd, however, wasn't as patient. "Anything illegal in there, officer?" Elijah's voice cut through the moment, polite but carrying a quiet challenge that left no room for pretense. Carden's jaw clenched. Abruptly, he snapped the journal shut and shoved it back into the bag, frustration now etched into every line of his face. "You're free to go," he barked, stepping back with a kind of forced authority that betrayed his own discomfort. But Elijah didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, tilting his head slightly as he regarded the officer. "Not so fast," he said, his voice low but commanding enough to cut through the street noise like a blade. "You stopped me. Accused me of fitting some vague description. Rifled through my personal belongings in front of all these people. I think we're owed an explanation." The crowd responded instantly, voices rising in agreement. "Yeah, what's the reason?" someone called out. "You can't just walk away from this," another voice echoed. Phones were no longer discreetly recording. Cameras were now openly pointed straight at Carden, their owners waiting for his next move. The officer shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The earlier confidence, the smug authority, it was slipping, crumbling under the collective scrutiny of the crowd. The longer he stood there, the clearer it became. He was the one being watched now. Elijah stood firm, his posture calm yet unyielding. There was no need for aggression, no need for raised voices or sudden movements. His mere presence, his refusal to shrink, was enough. For the first time, Carden looked trapped. Elijah locked eyes with him, the silence between them stretching taut like a drawn bowstring. "You're not going to answer?" Elijah asked, his voice carrying effortlessly over the murmurs. "What's this description I supposedly fit?" Carden opened his mouth. No words came out. Because the truth? It was standing in front of him. There had never been a description. There had only been an excuse. Elijah let the silence stretch a little longer, then, with deliberate slowness, took a single step closer. "Let me guess," he said, his tone still composed but now sharpened, cutting straight to the bone. "Black man. Walking down the street. Minding his own business. That about sums it up, doesn't it?" A wave of murmurs and gasps rippled through the crowd, the weight of the accusation hanging thick in the air. Carden's jaw tightened. His hands flexed at his sides. But there was nothing to say. Nothing that wouldn't make it worse. Elijah took another step, his voice lowering just enough that only Cardon could hear the next words. "You see, officer," he said, his tone even unwavering. "What you just did. It wasn't about keeping the streets safe. It was about power. You thought you could humiliate me, intimidate me, maybe even escalate this into something worse." Cardon's face was red now, his breathing just a little sharper, his stance just a little tenser. "But you didn't expect me to stay calm, did you?" Elijah continued, his voice never rising, never wavering. "You didn't expect me to be a Navy SEAL. You didn't expect me to have the discipline to keep my cool or the experience to see exactly what this was." The tension reached its peak, the moment suspended in electric silence. And then Elijah took a slow, deliberate step back. He reached down, picked up his bag, and slung it over his shoulder once more. Then, turning his back on Cardon without another word, he stepped off the curb and walked away. The crowd? They didn't move. They just kept recording. The tension in the air was almost tangible, thick with expectation. The crowd had gone still, hanging on every word, their phones capturing the moment in real time. Elijah's presence commanded the space, his composure a stark contrast to the officer's unraveling confidence. Cardon swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he struggled to come up with something, anything, that would salvage what little control he had left. But there was no way out, no procedural excuse strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of dozens of recording eyes. Cardon started, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just following protocol." The crowd groaned. Someone scoffed loudly. "Protocol?" A man near the front echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "Is that what we're calling racial profiling now?" A woman nearby crossed her arms. "Just say what you mean, officer. You saw a black man walking and decided he looked suspicious." Elijah didn't move, didn't blink. He simply let their words settle over Cardon like the weight of an unavoidable truth. And then, in the kind of calm that made it impossible to ignore him, he spoke again. "Let's get something straight," Elijah said, his voice smooth but unyielding. "Suspicion isn't a feeling. It's not a hunch. It's not a gut instinct rooted in bias. Suspicion is supposed to be based on facts, on actual evidence. But the only evidence you had today was the color of my skin." Cardon flinched. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. "You can keep dodging, keep reaching for excuses," Elijah continued, his voice growing sharper now, "but we both know the truth. And so does everyone watching." Elijah gestured to the sea of phones still held high, their screens aglow, broadcasting every second. Cardon's breathing was uneven now, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The authority he had relied on so effortlessly at the beginning of this encounter had slipped through his fingers like sand. He had no control here. Not anymore. And then Elijah delivered the final blow. "You didn't expect me to push back," he said, his words precise, deliberate. "You thought you could get away with this. Maybe because you have before. Maybe because no one challenged you. But not today." Elijah shook his head, his disappointment cutting deeper than anger ever could. "Today you picked the wrong person." The crowd erupted. Applause. Cheers. A chorus of voices calling out. "Hold him accountable. Enough is enough. We see you." Cardon looked around, his face pale, his stance unsteady. He knew what was coming. Knew that, in a matter of minutes, this moment would be all over social media. Knew that his name would be trending for all the wrong reasons. Elijah watched him, studied the way his bravado had crumbled under the weight of accountability. Then, slowly, methodically, Elijah slid his phone back into his pocket. He had nothing left to say. The world was already listening. And with that, he turned and walked away. The crowd parted for him, stepping back with a quiet reverence as he moved through them. "Officer Cardon?"